So I have on the board, does behavior change really exist? And the other day, one of the students asked, how do we change behavior? And I think I laughed for like 20 minutes straight, because exactly, that's the million-dollar question, is how do we really change behavior? And this weekend I was talking to a friend of mine, and he's like, how do you get to the behavior change of the adult, of doing it differently? And I'm like, it's practically impossible. So I really wanted to talk about some behavior change models and what behavior is, behavior change, and why it's so difficult to do. So, can we change behavior? I believe we can. And I've said before, tendency does not change. So there's a very famous little anecdote where there's a frog and the scorpion is like, can I jump on your back and take a trip to the other side of the pond? And the frog is like, no, you'll bite me, you'll sting me. The scorpion's like, no, I won't. And he's like, yeah, that's what you do. And he's like, I promise you I will not. Please let me just jump on your back and take a trip across the pond with you. So the frog was suckered in and said, okay. And once the scorpion jumps off, stings him. He's like, why'd you do it? He goes, because it's in my nature. So we have to remember, tendency is nature. This does not change. And there are a few behavior change models that take into account this idea of nature versus nurture. We study this a lot in psychology and public health. And it's very important to understand this. Tendency does not change, behavior changes. So this is extremely important to understand when you're working with a person, what their nature and what their tendency is. This is the beauty of the astrological wheel, is that your sun, your moon, and ascendant primarily are going to talk about your archetypes that we did a few weeks ago. I don't have the handout, but I do have a great book called The Hero Within. In this book, Carol Pearson, she only talks about 6 archetypes, but there's another one that is all 12 of her archetypes, and there's a really cool little test in there, and it's called What Story Are You Living? And it's about these archetypes. So in the astrology chart, what we talk about is what are the archetypes, or what are the tendencies. So for instance, I'm a Pisces, Cancer moon with a Sagittarius ascendant. That's going to be my flavor. That's going to be my nature, my tendency. That is not going to change. That is also when we talk about the behavior change model of the mother, father, child triad, we're going to understand why we need to understand our narrative, why we need to understand that origin story, because that origin story never changes. And when we get into the origin story of relationships, that also never changes. But just like in behavior change, we can renegotiate the terms, so to speak, of our birth. That's why it's considered a rebirth. Or we can renegotiate the terms of the relationship we have with ourselves, our body, our families, our colleagues, our friends. And it's the behavior that changes. So this is a very important construct that we have to understand. Because if you think you're going to change someone's origin or someone's tendency or someone's nature, you're going to do them wrong. So oftentimes I talk about being judgmental. When you're with clients and you talk about judgment, or you talk about that you notice that you judge a thought that they said to you, or you make a nonverbal, that's where you have to pay attention, because if you try to put and impart your nature onto another person, you can harm them, and that's very dangerous. So we have to always keep in check our own sort of emotions and our own nature so that we understand who we are. So does behavior change really exist? My personal opinion is yes, but it's very hard, and it's very small. So I put up a few models. This is the trans-theoretical model of behavior change. This is one of my favorites. I wrote my master's thesis on it. This is the health belief model, which I'll talk to you a little bit about my own personal experience that I'm having, and then of course my model, the mother, father, child triad. And I want to talk to you about a metaphysical law. Why this model works so well is because it's based on this law called the law of octaves, and I'll get to that in a minute. So what do behavior change models try to do? Basically, what we try to do is explain why it's difficult to change behavior, or why certain people change behavior and others can't or won't or don't. And a lot of these constructs are important to understand. And so first and foremost, that the person's nature isn't going to change, so their behavior has to be in alignment with their sort of core tendency and core nature in order for them to change. So this is a model by Prochaska, and it's called the Trans-Theoretical Model of Behavior Change. I like this model because I first like the diagram. As you can see, I'm into diagrams. So I like the diagram. I think it's self-explanatory. The change is a constant. It's a constant cycle. So Trans-Theoretical Model of Behavior Change says that you can change your behavior, but it follows this order. The first stage is pre-contemplation. The second is contemplation. The third is preparation. The fourth is action. And the fifth is maintenance. One of the things I really like about this model for behavior change is that it takes 6 months for each stage. So we have 2 years. And this is something that we pretty much have observed. Whether you're looking at something like astrology, a Saturn cycle of 2 years, which is your skinny cow, where you're going to condense and you're going to change some behaviors, or change some emotions, or change some thoughts, or work, to try to change your Costco card. We pretty much know in the behavioral sciences that change takes about 2 years for it to occur. So we can see this in a lot of the models that we're working with, and we can see this, like I said before, in astrology. So each stage should last about 6 months. So what is pre-contemplation? Pre-contemplation is where the client doesn't even know that they have an issue. It is super important that we understand where the client is coming from. If we don't know where they are in the behavior that they're trying to change, we can harm them or we don't help them. If the client isn't even aware, there is no awareness, you'll see in the mother, father, child triad. If there is no awareness, you can't start talking about preparation and action. So a couple years ago, I had a client who, like me, had a cult experience. And one of the very common things in cult culture is to change your name. You change your name to a spiritual name. Usually the leader of the group will give it to you. And it's supposed to quantify the essence, your essence. So this girl comes to see me. She had left the cult, and I remember starting out the session and seeing when she was in pre-contemplation, she didn't even know her name. Like, I remember wanting to write her name on the paper, as I usually do when I start with a client, and saying, you don't even know your name. So how could we talk about more severe things if we are talking about somebody who has a basic necessity to know just their name, because they had been in this cult culture for so long that they hadn't identified with their birth name. So we have to meet the client where we are at, always. Super important. Always meet your client, you as well, where they are. So even though you might be very aware of what's happening to them, they may not be aware. Of course, every time someone gets divorced, the friends chime in and say, oh, I always knew that about him, or, oh, I always saw that about her, and you get this unsolicited feedback about your old relationship. Everyone always knew, so you were in contemplation. You were the dumbass who had no clue what was going on in your relationship. Well, same thing happens sometimes with clients. They come in and they're not aware that perhaps they're in an abusive relationship, or they're at a job where they're being, violated or whatnot. And part of our job is to make people aware or bring it to their attention. But understand that pre-contemplation, this person has no idea that there's a need, a necessity, or anything for them to change, okay? So, next stage is contemplation. Now the person is thinking about changing. There might be a reason that they want to change. The next stage is preparation. This is when, for James, who loves to give, information to clients, this is where you can suggest perhaps books to read, you can give them an article, you can share a quote with them or send them a YouTube video, and this is where you can start introducing the client to possibilities other than their box. Okay, so only at preparation. So here we are, 6, 12, 18 months. 18 months, and we're only on preparation when someone comes without awareness about an issue. Someone might come, as we've seen, thinking that it's about their car accident, and what we find out, it's, that they're not allowed to have nice new things because their parents were broke at the moment of conception. So we bring them to sort of be aware why they're really coming to see us. We're talking about 18 months before just the preparation. We have not even started action and maintenance, and we have to keep this in mind. That clients need to have a realistic timeline of how long it takes to change the small, tiny, minute behaviors that aren't so minute, because I have this saying that I learned in a Labyrinth class that I took several years back. It says, if you do it in one area, you do it in all areas. And it's that sort of thing. If the person is going to change something very, very small, it's actually going to be a very much larger erection, so to speak. If you think of the box, and we get them to just change a little bit, they're actually going to have an expanded viewpoint of everything in their life. So a small behavior change is not really small. The thing is that we're such a society of validation, of competition, that we want, to change behavior overnight, and we think that, because we diet for 2 weeks or 2 months, that behavior change has occurred, and then we wonder why, we gained it all back 6 weeks later. Because true behavior change had not really been established. So bringing a client to preparation, where you're beginning to give them suggestions or tools to help modify, takes, according to TTM, a minimum of 18 months. Okay, they could stay in contemplation longer than 6 months. There are many people that are in the world smoking or drinking or eating unhealthy foods, and unless there's something that triggers, they're not even thinking that that's a problem in their life. Okay? Next is action. So this is where the behavior change we would hope will happen. This is the action stage. According to Prochaska and the TTM model, the client must be 6 months, 6 consecutive months of behavior change. Did I bring my purse? Okay, I have this little DSM handout. I'll show it to you when we do personality theories. And one of the criteria that we see in a lot of these DSM psychological dysfunction categories in the DSM text, in the book that states all of the diagnostic statistical, it's the DSM, is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and it's the disorders in mental health. And when we do next month, theory of personality, we'll go into these. But one of the things that you often see in a lot of these criteria is that things have to show for 6 months consecutively so that we can determine that someone has a certain disorder. So this idea of being in a behavior change, whether it's positive or negative, is important to understand. Your client needs to be engaging in that behavior for 6 months in order to say that they're in the action stage. So what you see, and what I love, this is my favorite part about this model, is that it's dynamic. you see that every circle has an arrow that connects it. And after action is maintenance. And again, they should maintain for 6 months. Back in the 80s, Nutrisystem was really, really popular. Now Nutrisystem has sort of gotten a reboot and a new look with Marie Osmond and all of that. I think it's Marie Osmond. But Nutrisystem in the 80s, there were centers worldwide. And they did a really good job at honoring behavior change. So part of, besides giving you your prepackaged foods, you had to go to like these behavior change classes. I think it was like twice a week, or you had to go once a week or something like that. And then if you maintained your weight 6 months, then they started giving you money back. So there was an incentive, and an incentive is usually something that we're going to find in behavior change models. And part of the incentives that you're going to bring to your client's attention is maybe it's improved health, maybe it's a better relationship, maybe it's just overall feeling better emotionally. So part of our job is to bring up incentives for the behavior change so that they know that they're doing it for a benefit. We're going to see more of that in the health belief model. And so maintenance, they have to maintain for 6 months. So I thought this was such a great idea. They were and money is the greatest motivator. So they would start paying you back for the pounds that you kept off over these months. I think you had to be 6 months, like TTM states, in maintenance, and then they started giving you for each pound that you kept off. You had to go into the center, I think once a week or once a month and weigh yourself, whatever it was, and they would give you back your money. So I thought that was a really great thing, and I was very young back then, but I remember that this made sense to me. Little did I know that I would be, studying public health and psychology and behavior health models, or behavior change models. But that was something that really stuck with me, and I was like, oh wow, what an interesting concept. Now they've, changed their whole identity, and I guess it's different, but that was something that in the 80s was very popular and very sort of famous about Nutrisystem. So having your client maintain behavior for 6 months. But one of the things, like I said, this model is dynamic. You could be in maintenance. You could be eating well because you just got diagnosed or had a heart attack. And after a certain amount of time, you can revert right back to pre-contemplation. How many of us haven't done that with weight, with smoking, with drinking, with poor relationships, with study habits, with sleeping habits? We are all guilty of this. And so it's very interesting. This to me just speaks so much volume. The fact that we can go from a maintenance phase, as I would call the maintenance is the convert, and converts are the worst. When people convert, they become gung-ho. They are so 0 to 100, it's ridiculous. Talk about 0 to 100. This is 100, and this is 0. And you can go, just like in the mother, father, child triad model, from 0 to 100, swinging. And it is part of Prochaska's TTM model. And I think that this is the most important thing that we understand. That behavior change rarely, unless there is a key change in values, in the value system of the person, rarely does it stay put. Usually what happens is you go right back to pre-contemplation, or you might go back to contemplation. So it's important, and this is why knowing values is so important part of behavior change. You have to know, and that's another thing here, which are those values that your client will change, and which are those that they're not going to change. And in the mother, father, child triad, what do I tell you is, once you've gone good bucket, bad bucket, and the fuck it bucket, you realize that if you have a change in values from something that you deem bad about your parents, you actually can move it over and just let it be, because it's part of, you can also move it into the good bucket if you decide, that's okay. But you can get it out of your bad bucket. You have to understand, and your client needs to understand and be truthful and authentic with self about what values are going to be essential to their core. And so this weekend, I had my first chemo treatment, and I had a lot of time alone and a lot of time to think. I started thinking about this. I was so willing to compromise so many of my values, in the past couple of years when I was questioning so many things. And I really just am a homebody. I really just am a very calm, family-oriented sort of person. I'm not going to be someone that you're going to find out in the clubs very often. You're not going to see me drunk. These aren't things that I value. So even though I had to question and go through it, and at 44 was the first time I got high, and I'm 45, and 44, I never got drunk, but I got tipsy. It was the first time that I got somewhat altered. I went through the experience, and it's okay that you give permission to clients to experience so that they can come back to see what their true values are. And this is where you find your 48 to 52. Your 48 to 52 at the end of the day is going to tell you what your true values. Those things that you 0 to 100 really at the end of the day tell you what are not your true values. And I told you guys before about body image. Well, it's pretty easy for me to now understand that body image holds an important place. And it is a value that I had similar to my mother, and so I moved it over. And so thinking about that this weekend, I was like, when you really get down to it, the values that are core, and it's good to sort of nudge and sort of push your clients out of their comfort zone, but if we see that someone comes back to something, there probably is a core value there that isn't going to change. And if that value doesn't change, your behavior is not going to change. That's just the reality of it. These two are linked. So in my model, I talk about needs, unmet needs, I talk about values a lot, I talk about judgments, I talk about emotions, but basically when we get down to #DoItDifferently, you made a deal with yourself, a contract with yourself in your philosophy or your rule book, and you decided that you were going to honor something in you for yourself. And you're never going to honor a change unless you truly believe in it. That's just the reality of it. And this brings up contracts. Behavioral contracts. Having an understanding of behavioral change model, whichever one you subscribe to, whatever your theoretical perspective is, I like this idea of behavioral contracts. I do those in my adult, when we do the MFC triad in relationships, the truth is in the triangle. We're going to talk more about contracts that I do with couples, so that what I call the I, and the we is established, and each individual is getting their needs met, but also the relationship is getting what it needs. But behavioral contracts is where you sit down with a client, you make a goal, and you give it a certain time frame. And these are SMART goals. I talked about these last week. So when we write goals, we write them in SMART format, which is specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. So these goals, whether it's for this model or this model, is something that you can use with any behavioral contract. And I highly recommend it. I'll give you guys a sample. Remind me, Ms. Ravachi, to give a sample of a behavioral contract. There might be one in the book, but it could be very simple. I have a simple one where I actually type up these parts, so I just have to write it in with the client. A good thing might be that the client write it in. You have them sign it, you have them date it, you put a goal that's a SMART goal at the top, and what steps they're going to take in order to achieve this goal. Okay? And this keeps continuity. This allows you in session to go back to what it is that the client came for. It doesn't mean that you can't go off path, but you can check in with them each week or each session to make sure, or just follow up with them so that there's a continuity that way. And it allows clients to observe that they may change. People need incentives. People need to know that what they're doing is working. If not, we sort of get uninterested. We lose motivation. And we're not going to talk about intrinsic and extrinsic, but in the health belief model, we talk about self-efficacy. And there is a belief in ourselves whether or not we can make a change. And if we don't believe in ourselves, if we don't have that intrinsic motivation and give it extrinsically as a therapist, then the client might have difficulty. And so these contracts are a good way to sort of demonstrate to clients, look, you did do this before. You can do it again. And even though we know change may not necessarily be continuous, and there might be gaps because you might go from maintenance to contemplation, you have now written proof. That's the point of the rule book, step 6 in the triad, where you have proof that you have rules, that you've done it, and that you could do it again. Because over time, if someone does something consistently, even though there have gaps and breaks, let's say that they do it for 6 months, you can start helping them to perhaps change. And overall, the way I like to describe it to my clients, and I use physical coins, or fake gold coins, is I put the gold coins on the floor or on the table, and I say, have you changed behavior more times than the times that you haven't? And if you've changed the behavior in a larger quantity, so out of these 40 years, let's say that you've been living, have you been doing the change longer than not? Then I say you would. So that's one of the things I like to use as a visual with clients, is that they can see and quantify the success. And that's one of the benefits of these behavioral contracts. So we will give you a sample so that you can use it with your client. Any questions on Prochaska and TTM? Okay. Next is the health belief model. Okay, and I don't remember who wrote this. Is it in that article? And this is a model that it's in the name. You believe that you deserve optimal health. Health defined as you want. The World Health Organization defines it one way, you might define it the other way. Let's say health for you is wealth, or health is not having joint pain, or health is being, cancer-free. At this point, everybody in the room is going to have a different definition of what health is for them based on their previous, health history or whatnot. Whereas maybe your small child, for them, health is just being able to, get their Xbox and, play with their friends or whatnot. So it's inherent in the name, the health belief model. Do you believe that you deserve health? Do you believe that you have what it takes, the belief in yourself, to actually be healthy? So first, defining. I cannot get over the importance of having your clients define what they say. And this is something that is on the behavioral contract, is where you have them define the goal. That's why it's SMART. Okay? You must have clients define what they mean by healthy, what they mean by emotionally stable, what they mean by sleeping through the night. Because everyone's perception is different. And these are very key factors in this model. Perception, perceived risk to benefits. So as you all know, my cancer is back and I started chemo last week. and I'm out of breath and I'm not feeling very well today, as I'm on day 6 of the treatment, and I want to quit, and I think I'm going to quit. And I have a lot of people that are telling me to hang in there, and I just don't think that chemotherapy is for me. It's extremely barbaric in my opinion. It is something that is just not bearable to me. I don't